I believe this is an extremely important conference in very, very difficult times. The world is, in at least a generation or two generations, is facing an unprecedented security challenges. And I'm not talking only about the terrible war in Ukraine or terrible conflict in the Middle East or growing Chinese assertiveness and aggressivity in East Asia or elsewhere in the world. This development, I'm also talking about this kind of a shift or movement of many world societies and countries towards populism and indeed towards fascism. This definitely will be posing another challenge for human rights issues around the world, for religion freedoms, etc. When it comes to human rights and religion freedoms, the situation is, if you watch the situation in China, the situation ever since President Xi Jinping came to power worsened terribly in China. All religion freedoms, all minorities in China are under unprecedented assault from the Communist Party, perhaps the biggest assault since the era of Mao Zedong. I'm a former journalist, and when I was preparing for this conference, of course, I did some research. And yesterday I found an absolutely horrifying article which was published yesterday in Foreign Policy, which is calling Erasing Tibet. It addresses several issues, but one of the issues this article talks about the most are the residential schools, which is a very similar program to the concentration camps China established in Xinjiang province. And there is it is close to 1 million Tibetan children between the age of 4 and 18 forcibly interned in those schools. And the main purpose of these schools is to erase their Tibetan identity, to destroy their language, to destroy their religion, to destroy their roots. So China is facing the world is facing unprecedented challenges, and the minorities in China and any leftovers of civil society which were there are facing unprecedented assault. That's why I consider this conference and addressing these issues so important. I would like to start this conference. There is many distinguished desks. I would like to invite now to the stand Ms. Tencho Gyatso, the President of International Campaign for Tibet. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends of Tibet, Tashitele, everyone, I would like to welcome all of you to this ICT and Czech Support Tibet side event on Tibet on the margins of the International Ministerial Conference on Freedom of Religion and Belief here in Prague. We are really honored to have here with us today some honorable guests and distinguished speakers. I'd like to first recognize Ms. Undersecretary Azar Zaya, the U.S. Undersecretary for Civil Liberties, Democracy, Human Rights, and also Special Coordinator for Tibet. And I'd like to recognize Ms. Bea ten Tusche, Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief of the Kingdom of Netherlands. We have also our friends from Taiwan, Ambassador of Taiwan. We'll be joined shortly by Ambassador Rashad Hussain also from the United States. And we have Telo Turku Rinpoche, representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Russia, Mongolia, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. He gave yesterday a very compelling address during the first session of the ministerial. The title of today's event is A Path Forward to Peace and Stability and in Asia and the world, and the vision of the Dalai Lama. Why have we chosen this topic? Because we are convinced that His Holiness the Dalai Lama's vision to transform Tibet into a zone of peace, presented almost 40 years ago today, is more relevant than ever. It was 21st of September 1987 at the United States Congress, and a few months later, in June 1988, in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama presented a 5-point peace plan that laid out an ambitious future for Tibet. I would like to read an extract. The Tibetan people are eager to contribute to regional and world peace, and I believe they are in a unique position to do so. Traditionally, Tibetans are a peace-loving and non-violent people. Since Buddhism was introduced to Tibet over 1,000 years ago, Tibetans have practiced non-violence with respect to all forms of life. This attitude has also been extended to our country's international relations. Tibet's highly strategic position in the heart of Asia, separating the continent's great powers, India, China, and the USSR, has throughout history endowed it with the essential role in the maintenance of peace and stability. This is precisely why, in the past, Asia's empires went to great lengths to keep one another out of Tibet. Tibet's value as an independent buffer state was integral to the region's stability. Today, in 2023, Russia and China can certainly be considered as two of the most dangerous regimes on earth that are imposing violent domestic repressive policies and have deployed aggressive foreign policies, with a war against one neighboring country in the case of Russia. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's call to transform the strategic Tibetan plateau, also known as the roof of the world or the water tower of Asia, is still very relevant. Such a plan should be put in place during the lifetime of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as he is the only one who holds that authority and the trust that's needed to convince the 6 million Tibetans to accept it. We believe Beijing should not consider His Holiness as the problem, but rather as the solution for Tibet. His Holiness will turn 90 in 2025, and as Chinese assimilationist policies are threatening the survival of culture, religion, and identity, it is urgent that China resumes dialogue with the Tibetan side. The international community, and in particular EU member states, and the US, we believe should be at the front line of this issue and deploying their efforts to convince China to find a long-term and stable solution to the ongoing crisis in Tibet. So we will hear from speakers today more about the situation in Tibet. This afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen, after several years of hard work, our friends from the Czech Support Tibet are releasing a new book on the relations between Václav Havel and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who have been very close friends. His Holiness has visited the Czech Republic almost 11 times, including twice after the passing of Václav Havel. Václav Havel remains a wonderful and unique source of inspiration and a symbol of nonviolence for us all. He was a special friend for Tibet, honoring His Holiness the Dalai Lama as he took leadership of this country as a guest of honor of the state. I would like to conclude today with a quote from Václav Havel. Human rights are universal and indivisible. Human freedom is also indivisible. If it is denied to anyone in the world, it is therefore denied indirectly to all people. This is why we cannot remain silent in the face of evil or violence. Thank you all, and thank you especially to all those who helped behind the scenes, helping put this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the welcoming note. I was supposed to mention in my opening remarks also that this is live streamed online today. It's my utter pleasure and honor to invite the next guest, Ms. Uzra Zeya. She is a U.S. Undersecretary for Civilian Security, for Democracy and Human Rights, and a special coordinator for Tibetan issues. Please welcome.
Thank you, Tomasz and Tencho, for the kind introduction and your welcoming remarks. Good morning, everyone, and Tashidelek. It's a pleasure for me to be with all of you here today in beautiful, snow-covered Prague. Again, my name is Uzra Zeya, and I am the United States Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues. I'd first like to thank the International Campaign for Tibet for organizing this session. I'd also like to thank our distinguished moderator and speakers for offering their insights on this vitally important issue, and also thank the Czech Republic for hosting this year's International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance Ministerial Conference. Thank you all. My friends, we gather here today in a world marked by conflict. From Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, Hamas's brutal terrorism in Israel and the ensuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, and increasing repression throughout the People's Republic of China. These are times when peace feels uncertain. Around the world, we see authoritarian governments that are increasingly intolerant of ideas, beliefs, and practices different from their own. They espouse political systems that ignore and even undermine internationally recognized human rights, democratic governance, and the rule of law. The tragic events unfolding in Tibet mark just one example of this troubling dynamic. Tibetan Buddhism, a religion Tibetan Buddhists describe as rooted in compassion, empathy, and nonviolence, lies at the heart of Tibet's identity and cultural heritage. In most Tibetan homes, you'll find an altar with images of the Buddha of compassion, Chenre Zig. Prayers mark the hours of the day, and monasteries dot the landscape. Monks and nuns, who play revered roles in Tibetan society, serve as leaders, educators, and stewards of Tibet's language and environment, passing their knowledge on down to future generations. As I'm sure my Tibetan friends would agree, for many Tibetans, their Buddhist faith is inextricably linked to the very identity of Tibetans themselves. And yet, Chinese Communist Party officials somehow portray this religion of peace as an existential threat to the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. Tibetan Buddhism runs contrary to Chinese Communist Party ideology, which dictates that loyalty to the party is paramount, and that religion and spirituality are phenomena to be controlled and co-opted by the state. For decades, the PRC has developed a draconian system of repression that aims to sinicize Tibetan Buddhism. It seeks to subsume this rich and vibrant spiritual tradition into the PRC's political framework and reshape its core tenets in accordance with the values of the CCP. For example, so-called patriotic campaigns require monks and nuns to pledge loyalty to the Chinese state. They must obtain permission to travel or even to hold religious events or gatherings. The state approves reincarnations and even maintains a registry of officially recognized lamas. And perhaps most concerning, the PRC has made clear that they have every intention of co-opting the succession process of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. These restrictions also apply to lay Tibetans. Children are prohibited from participating in religious activities or even receiving religious education. Families are no longer able to hang pictures of His Holiness in their homes, and gone are the prayer flags that used to flutter in the crisp air of the Tibetan plateau. Looking outward, the PRC's interference in Tibetan Buddhism extends beyond its borders, demonstrating a troubling pattern of transnational repression. This aligns with broader PRC efforts to reshape the global human rights discourse, especially regarding the freedom of religion or belief. The international community's response to PRC abuses is therefore not only directly tied to the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Tibetans, it is an affirmation of our collective commitment to safeguarding human rights. So it is in these challenging times that we need to look to leaders like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who remind us that despite the challenges, despite the uncertainty, there is always hope. And that hope, that possibility for positive change, needs to be undergirded by our actions. It's here that we, as policymakers and advocates, have an indispensable role to play. So the United States is meeting this call to action in 3 important ways. First, the United States has deepened its engagement with partners and allies, recognizing that multilateral collaboration is foundational to building broad and results-oriented advocacy for the Tibetan community. In August, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom co-sponsored a Department of State-supported event at the World Water Week conference in Stockholm, which raised awareness of the PRC's unsustainable environmental practices on the Tibetan plateau and displacement of Tibetan nomads. Over the course of the past year, we also saw Tibet highlighted in high-profile multilateral statements, including from the G7, expressing serious concern over the human rights situation in the PRC. We will continue to increase international solidarity in support of Tibetans' human rights and preservation of their unique cultural, religious, and linguistic identity. Second, as the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, I'm proud that the United States continues to lead in bringing attention to the PRC's human rights abuses. We continue to call on the PRC to resume meaningful and direct dialogue with the Dalai Lama or his representatives without preconditions at the highest levels of our government. This past February, we hosted the first in-person Losar celebration since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, with representatives there from over a dozen countries. There, Secretary Blinken reaffirmed the State Department's resolve to defend and promote the human rights of Tibetans and recommitted to working alongside the global Tibetan community. It's events like this where we remember the importance of celebrating Tibet's rich religious, linguistic, and cultural heritage and passing it on to the next generation. And finally, the United States is backing up our words with our actions. This past August, the Department of State took historic steps to impose visa restrictions against PRC officials involved in the forced assimilation, as we heard, of over 1 million Tibetan children in government-run boarding schools. Last December, the United States also designated 2 PRC officials under the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program in connection with serious human rights abuses in Tibet. Moreover, the United States is proud to be one of the leading donors to Tibetan communities worldwide, providing more than $24 million this past year for cultural and linguistic preservation efforts, scholarships for Tibetan youth, support for Tibetan institutes across Asia, development of the Central Tibetan Administration's virtual election system, healthcare, education, and job training, and so much more. This week, my esteemed colleague, Rashad Hussain, the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, and I are honored to participate in this IRFBA Ministerial Conference. We're here to promote respect for freedom of religion or belief, as well as to advance avenues to protect members of religious minority groups, including Tibetans. But let me be clear, our work does not stop here. The United States resolve is unwavering, and we will continue to work tirelessly to advance the human rights and dignity of all Tibetans. Let me leave you with this. For decades, the Dalai Lama has used his faith as a bridge to connect with others and uncover the common thread of our shared humanity. This week, let us continue this work, promoting dialogue, building understanding, and creating a freer and more just world for all. Thank you.
Thank you very mumuch, the Undersecretary Zaya, for her remarks. Let me now please welcome and invite Ms. Bea ten Toscher, Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief of the Kingdom of Netherlands. Please welcome.
Dear friends, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a great honor to be here with you, and thank you, Tomasz, for your kind words. You look familiar to me. You know, I was a young diplomat here from 92 to 95, and it's unbelievable how much Prague has changed, remaining its eternal beauty, but modernizing and being part of the international world, which had just started when I was here as a young diplomat. So it's wonderful to be back, and thank you for inviting me. And also thank you to the International Campaign for Tibet and Czechs supporting Tibet, which was already the case, I think, when I was here. I remember attending some sessions, and they were very inspirational. So the Czechs and Tibet are friends, which is symbolized by this beautiful book that was just presented. Also, thank you very much, Uzra Zaya, United States Undersecretary. It's a great honor to be here together with you and to hear your inspirational words. And Tencho Gyatso, for the courage, for the brave efforts you and your people have been doing for so many decades under the oppression of the People's Republic of China, which, frankly, I find very difficult to understand. Why would a strong nation like China need to oppress smaller religious minorities? Why do they need that? Big, strong nations can afford to be magnanimous and peace promoters. Why don't we see that in China? That is a question I would like to ask the Chinese authorities, and I will when I have a chance. So peace and freedom of religion are closely related, as you already outlined in your speeches, and they're close to my heart in my career as a diplomat. And human rights have always been guiding me, as well as now the interreligious cooperation we have seen in many countries, we still see in many countries. Recently, I visited Indonesia, which was a very good example of that. Despite all the challenges this country still faces as a very young and very large, the largest Muslim nation in the world, but their brave efforts, especially of civil society and the young people, to maintain that interreligious harmony gives me great hopes. And I think we should closely look at young people, the youth in the world, to embrace them, to make them embrace these campaigns, because the youth is the future. Now, what can we see when it comes to interreligious cooperation? Some great inspirational examples. Václav Havel was already mentioned. Desmond Tutu, who was as magnanimous as great nations should be in reaching out the hands to the former adversaries. And also the lifelong peace message of the Dalai Lama, whom I had the pleasure to meet when I was an ambassador in Guatemala, where he held one of his inspirational speeches. So that was great inspiration to me as well. We all know, however, that religion can also cause conflicts and wars when it's not used as the spiritual inspiration that the Dalai Lama and other leaders are giving us, but it's used as a weapon to unify people against a perceived external enemy, as we see President Putin doing, using the Russian Orthodox Church, the great institution, against external enemies. And that is a great pity. To use religion to divide people and not to unify the people in China and in Tibet. Key in my function is to search for inspiring examples which promote the freedom of religion and promote human rights. And when you look at the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has existed for 75 years, we will celebrate this on the 10th of December, it's great to go back to the basics, the 4 fundamental freedoms of Eleanor and President Roosevelt. And the first one is the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, in that order. The second one is freedom of expression, to be yourself, to show your identity. The third one is to do that without fear of imprisonment, of being a victim of your convictions. And the fourth one is freedom from hunger and thirst, as we now unfortunately see in many parts of the world, and Gaza was already mentioned. These are the 4 fundamental freedoms, and basically their bottom line is human dignity. And that is the phrase, human dignity, I have discovered, I have been inspired with all my life, and that's what I see the Tibetans do also. They want human dignity, simple dignity for their nuns, for their monks, for their youth who are now taken into these schools to be brainwashed. And that is the most threatening and most disgraceful measure a government can take. To take the youth away, the future away from a people, from a religious minority. And that cannot be defended. I have no way to explain that. But it's certainly a very devious strategy. This restrictive effort on cultural and religious freedoms in Tibet, and also affecting the privacy of Tibetan Buddhists, the education I already mentioned, is far-reaching, and it reaches out to all of us. And that's why we should all stand up for these symbols that are being oppressed, the religious minorities that are being oppressed, because it's a sign of civilization worldwide to allow these minorities to thrive. It's a litmus test for any democracy to look after minorities. And if you don't do that, you cannot call yourself a democracy. It's as simple as that. Universal freedom of religion does not allow for politicization. And spiritual decisions are up to spiritual leaders, the Dalai Lama and his followers, and not to politicians. It should not be used as a weapon. Finally, I would like to close with a word of hope. I was reading in my job, I have the privilege of reading very interesting literature. I was reading the work of Church Father Augustinus, who lived, I think, in 341 after Christ, and he said, hope. Hope is like a mother and a father with two daughters. And one daughter shows anger at situations that are terrible, that are disgraceful to human dignities. And the second daughter is the daughter of courage, of a good fight the good fight, to achieve what enhances human dignity, and work on this strategically, peacefully, and with a lot of determination. And that is what I see the Tibetans do. That's what I see the spiritual leaders and the day-to-day life people do. And I would like to extend our hearts and our hands of support, unwavering support. You are not alone. As Uzra already said, you are not alone. You will never be alone. We will always be surrounding you with love, with compassion, and with support wherever you need it. So that is the last thing I wanted to share with you. Don't give up, because we are in this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this powerful address. I would like to now invite to this desk the panelists, Mr. Telo Tulku Rinpoche, please, Mr. Petr Jan Vinch, and Mr. Buchung Tsering, please. I will start this panel, by asking Mr. Telo Tulku Rinpoche, representative of His Holiness to Dalai, of the Dalai Lama, to Mongolia, Russia, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. I will ask you for your address, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. For me, it's been an honor as a Kalmyk immigrant, born in America, sent to India at the age of 7, and growing up in a Tibetan refugee Buddhist monastery that has been reestablished by the hard work of many of the Tibetan refugees and under the leadership and vision and guidance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I spent 13 years as a Buddhist monk, and later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, having that opportunity to serve the community where my parents and grandparents have come from. And growing up, being known as this boy from America in a Buddhist monastery, fair-skinned, open-minded, rebellious, and I've been very fortunate to be known by His Holiness since I was 6 years old. From time to time, His Holiness mentions, when I see him with other dignitaries, delegations that I've led from various parts of the community, His Holiness tends to stress out, my friend. It's an honor, it's a blessing, but for me, to be mentioned as a friend of the Dalai Lama is beyond words that I can really express. I really see His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a hero, as a champion of peace. And what he has done not only for the Tibetan people, but on a global scale, it is beyond words of expression. I've been having the honor to serve as His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a role of representative since 2015. And I happen to be the only non-Tibetan Tibetan civil servant. I usually joke by saying I happen to be the only non-Tibetan Tibetan bureaucrat. But some of my colleagues don't like the word bureaucrat. But nevertheless, I've been involved or been in many presence in occasions, His Holiness meeting dignitaries, government officials, I can say billionaires or millionaires, entertainers, as well as people from day-to-day life. And I'm truly amazed by his unconditional compassion, love, kindness, care, and attention that he provides to every single human being that he comes across. My office of Tibet, based in Moscow, which still continues to operate without my presence. Our mission has been slightly different than the Office of Tibet in Washington or London or Brussels and other parts of the world. We promote His Holiness's 4 main principles, and that is principle number 1, promotion of human values, promotion of love, compassion, kindness, tolerance, forgiveness. Second commitment is His Holiness's vision of interreligious harmony or dialogue. From my years working in Russia and having a direct communication and relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church and many fellow Muslims, mainly particularly from Dagestan, from Chechnya, and other parts of Russia. As a child growing up, I really did not understand the concept of interreligious harmony. As you can imagine, I was brought up in a very conservative monastery where people tend to think only of your religion as the best religion, and that's what you should believe. It took me many years to understand what His Holiness truly meant by interreligious harmony. At the very beginning stage, of course, I was very conservative as well. But I was very fortunate to have good teams of other religious traditions. The more that we sat down and talked, the more we argued, the more we disagreed, the more we exchanged views of God, enlightenment, Buddha, nirvana. It really opened up many doors to understanding, respect, the values of communication, the values of simple humanity on a human level. And I truly find it worthwhile for all of us to engage in dialogue and interreligious harmony. Harmony is not something that falls from the sky. We all know that. And we repeat it like a mantra over and over again. Peace doesn't fall down from the sky. It starts from grassroots levels and so on. But once we truly engage in interreligious dialogue, communication, networking, I think it truly breaks many boundaries among communities, religious communities, and beyond nations as well. I have tremendous respect for all major traditions, and every city I go to, I make an effort to visit many of the churches because I definitely feel the blessings, the aura, the hard work that those Christians have put into building their churches. Similarly, the Buddhists have also put in tremendous effort. And through this, you see a lot of tremendous similarities. The hard work, the dedication, the faith that everyone has put into it. There is so much similarities on a human level. And hopefully in the next 2 days, hopefully I'll have time to explore the beautiful city of Prague. And as you can see on my phone, I have many, many wonderful pictures of Orthodox churches, Roman Catholic churches, even as Muslim mosques, and so on. And I enjoy it. I enjoy the concept of interreligious harmony. Third, His Holiness speaks about protection of Tibet's, how to say the right word, Tibet's fragile ecological system. As Denchula has mentioned, Tibet being the roof of the world, or the water tank of the world, which also not only flows through Tibet, but the majority of the nations across Asia is hugely and highly dependent on the environment and ecological system of Tibet. Lastly, His Holiness speaks about reviving ancient Indian thought. And that thought is based on nonviolence, peace, love, and understanding. And that has been our mission in Russia, in Mongolia, and many of the former Soviet Union republics. Unfortunately, I had to leave because my voice and my thoughts shook Russia in a way that they became so scared. As a simple man, born in America, grew up with Buddhist principles, having the relationship with the Dalai Lama, and being influential among a minority. Of course, Buddhists in Russia, the number is very small. If you combine Buryat, Tuvians, and Kalmyks, it's probably less than 2 million people. But nevertheless, somebody who had influence over this minority communities definitely made the regime afraid and decided to label me as a foreign agent because I spoke out against the war and Russia's occupation of Ukraine. There is a lot of similarities. What the Chinese have done, Chinese communists have done in 1959 by occupying Tibet, and also Russia's occupation of Ukraine is also very similar, because once Chinese communism invaded Tibet, they started out from the east, slowly coming into central Tibet. And this is exactly what's repeating in the 21st century by Russia invading Ukraine, starting from the east and slowly moving in. So we see a lot of patterns, and it's almost like that China, Russia influenced China to become a communist state. And now China is influencing Russia of how to occupy a country. I just want to end here by expressing my sincere gratitude and honor to be a servant not only to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but the Tibetan people. They are truly a people of peace, nonviolent, compassionate, very loving. And throughout my years, I definitely learned a lot as a spiritual figure and also as a human being. And breaking beyond these boundaries, you definitely learn how much we have in common and the crisis that we face across the world in today's time. In Buddhism, we talk about interdependency, how much we are interdependent on a human level. And I truly believe in that. And I tell people that we are interconnected one way or another, whether we want to believe it or not. Economically, politically, and also in terms of health, in terms of our daily lives. We are interdependent. Whether we know the individual directly or not, we are all dependent on each other. So if that is the case, then why not love another? Why not be compassionate? Why not hug one another? Why not share the common goal, which is a better society, harmonious society, and a peaceful society? I will end here by thanking the Czech government for hosting us, bringing us together. It's been a wonderful second day, meeting people from different beliefs and different traditions and exchanging views. It's been very truly inspiring for me, and I look forward to future events like this in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Telotulku Rinpoche. And I will ask now another guest, Mr. Petr Jan Vinč, the Czech theologian, priest, and translator, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, first, thank you very much for your kind invitation here to this gathering. This gathering is mainly about the peace in Asia in general and in Tibet in particular. So you might rightfully ask, what does a Czech Anglican priest and a ecumenical bureaucrat has to say to this topic? But I have to say the world is very interconnected nowadays. And what happens in one part of the world has a direct influence on other parts. We see it with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which has direct influence on other parts of the world, be it Africa, be it Asia. We see it with the case of Taiwan, where the Chinese, still mostly verbal, not military aggression against Taiwan has a direct consequences on other part of the world, on the United States, on us in Europe as well. So the world is very, very interconnected, and so interconnected is also the question of freedom and human rights. Human rights are non-negotiable, and they cannot be divided. There is nothing like less important and more important human rights. Rights are rights. And if you pardon me and let me quote one Yiddish story, to be just a little free is like to be just a little pregnant. You or are free or you aren't. So from this point of view, the question of religious freedom and the freedom of belief, to which this ministerial conference is dedicated, is something very important and something that is very deeply connected to other human rights as well. I speak here also as a co-organizer of Red Wednesday, the event which takes place today, as it does every year on the Wednesday before the beginning of Advent, where Christian churches and the Federation of Jewish Communities in this country joins in a common remembrance of those who are persecuted for their faith and belief. We do this not because we would have this problem in our country. Thanks to God, we live in a country that is very free, that is very open, even though quite secular, to religious belief. But we do this exactly because we understand how interdependent the world is, and that the fact that we are at a liberty to express our faith and religion is also an obligation to us to defend those who doesn't have this right and possibility. We in Czech Republic or former Czechoslovakia, we have a historical experience with a totalitarian communist regime oppressing religious freedom. We have seen communist regime in this country imprisoning clergymen, influencing the election of church leaders. We've seen the communist regime trying to enforce a state license for ministers of religion, without which it would be a criminal offense to practice religion, and so on and so on. And I think to our Tibetan friends, all those things would sound very familiar, because that's exactly what's happening to them as well. So I wasn't a bit surprised when I read that the Chinese Communist government already announces that it would like to interfere in the choosing of the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because of course they would. That's what the communists do all the time. And that's exactly where we have to stand out and from our own historical experience point out that this is something that cannot be tolerated. The religious freedom in today's world is threatened by many actors, be it religious extremism, be it nationalism as a growing threat in some of the countries today, but it's mostly threatened by the oppressive, non-democratic governments. And here, China is a prime example. China, which does not only oppress Tibet, it oppresses other religious minorities and groups in China as well. We know the situation of Uyghur Muslim community, but we also see the Chinese interference into the Catholic Church and other Christian communities in the country. And what makes the situation even more frightful is the use of modern surveillance and artificial intelligence and all those high-tech equipment that is misused for one sole purpose of persecuting people for their faith or their belief. Václav Havel, who has already been quoted here, spoke about the power of the powerless. So I think when we ask what can a peace-loving and non-violent nation as Tibetans do in a world that is too often counting divisions, fighter jets and aircraft carriers, is to be a moral example and moral imperative. Moral imperative that makes other people act. I'm very happy and proud that Czech government, Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs welcomes this event as a part of Ministeriate. I'm very happy to see friends from Taiwan here, and I'm very proud that Czech Republic is once again leader in the world together with our friends and allies in respect of defending religious freedom in the world, because that's the power of the powerless. The religious communities have this moral imperative. They don't act by force, they act based on their conviction, and that's what makes them very dangerous to any totalitarian regime, because any religion as a set of moral values will always be a threat to totalitarianism, and the religious freedom is often the first of the freedoms to be suppressed by any aspiring totalitarian regime. So thank you for your effort, and we hope we would be of assistance as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. And now the last panelist, Mr. Huchung Tsering, the head of research unit of the International Campaign for Tibet. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I would want to touch on the issue of the significance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's vision in 4 ways, and then provide some sort of recommendations. The vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama as laid out here in his 4 commitments. The vision is pragmatic, it's practical, and it's mutually beneficial, not just for the Tibetan people, but for the international community. Tibetan Buddhist culture has the potential to, and not just has the potential, even contributes to the development of the world civilization. That's why His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been making this effort. And that's why he's concerned about the survival of the Tibetan Buddhist culture. The first aspect of the Chinese policy on Tibetan Buddhist culture is the fact that they are changing a policy from physical destruction in the initial stage to one of control today. Initially, they hoped that they would do away with Tibetan Buddhism by bombarding monasteries, making monks and nuns disappear. But they realized that this wasn't succeeding, and therefore now today they're trying to use Tibetan Buddhism to serve their political ends. Secondly, they're making Tibetan Buddhism subservient to the Chinese Communist Party. the little we know of communism says that it doesn't believe in religion. But here is a party that wants to make Buddhism not just part of the Chinese Communist Party system, but subservient to it. Thirdly, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is controlling Tibetan Buddhism through surveillance and use of new technology. We just came from the morning session of the ministerial, where there was focus on how today governments in different parts of the world are using new technology to control or to stop people's religious practices. This is very much happening in Tibet, and more so in the form of control over monks and nuns, whether it's through CCTV surveillance or whether it's through checking monks and nuns' phones, mobile phones, or installing systems, database of monks and nuns, or having party officials stationed in monasteries, etc., to control every aspect of Tibetan Buddhist culture. Fourthly, the Chinese government is trying to interfere in Tibetan Buddhist core tenet of reincarnation system. My previous colleagues already spoke about this. This has geopolitical implication, not just for Tibetans and Tibetan Buddhists, but also to followers of Tibetan Buddhism beyond Tibet, whether it's in the Russian Federation or the republics, or in the Indian Himalayan region, or in Bhutan, Nepal, or Mongolia, or even in the Czech Republic, where we have followers of Tibetan Buddhism. Every one of these Tibetan Buddhist followers are stakeholders in the future of the survival of Tibetan Buddhism, including the reincarnation processes. And therefore, they have a right to see that Chinese government respects Tibetan Buddhism. So my recommendations to governments, and particularly to the ministerial that's being held, is the following. First, and the Undersecretary there laid it out, that the US government is following a policy of multilateral, like-minded countries coming together. I would urge that they do that to develop a united policy on religious freedom of the Tibetan people. Secondly, the government should publicly support the traditional spiritual authority of the Dalai Lama, including in the matters concerning his reincarnation. More so, the ministerial should adopt a formal public position recognizing that decisions regarding the recognition of Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders, including that of the Dalai Lama, are exclusively spiritual matters that concerns Tibetan Buddhist community and the present Dalai Lama. Fourth, government should ask China to end the policy of Sinicization that eradicate Tibetan religion. Fifth, they should ask China to release all Tibetan political prisoners, particularly those who have been imprisoned for upholding their religious rights, with the Panchen Lama, who is detained, being the most important person there. Fifth, government should organize fact-finding delegations to Tibet to study the state of Tibetan religion, and then to provide appropriate recommendations. Sixth, they should ask China to end policies that approve the use of Tibetan language and pressure Beijing to engage in dialogue with representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to resolve the broader issue of Tibet. In particular, the Ministry of the Religious Freedom of Belief and Alliance has a steering committee, and I would suggest that the steering committee should establish contact and have an open and regular dialogue with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the democratically elected Central Tibetan administration on common efforts to promote religious freedom. Another suggestion would be for governments to explore opening of consulates in Lhasa. The United States already has a policy of doing that. Other governments should follow that, so that such consulates can provide opportunities for governments to monitor situations in Tibet. Lastly, governments should avail themselves of the opportunity of the upcoming fourth cycle of the UN Universal Periodic Review that's coming up in Geneva in January 2024 to raise the issue of Tibetan religious freedom. Now, our gathering here, the number of people may not be that large. The type of situation may not be that broad, but nevertheless, one critical contribution that today's meeting here, as well as the ministerial is making by having a visible focus on Tibetan Buddhism, is that it provides hope to the people in Tibet who are imprisoned, who are under Chinese government control, to know that the international community has not forgotten them. And that in particular, such meetings, including this site, even on Tibet, also provides an opportunity for the world to realize that Tibetan Buddhism and its survival is not the concern of the Tibetan Buddhists alone, but of the international community as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will have just a couple quick questions for our guests. I will start with a question for Mr. Telotulku Rinpoche. Do you think that the Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan religion, or Tibetan identity or culture can survive that assault, which is, we've seen, I think that Tibetan culture is I think it's been in history unprecedented what's happening, this assault on the Tibetan identity. Do you think this culture, the religion, can survive in China, or will it be more, or in Tibet, which is now occupied by China, or will it be more the role of Tibetan communities abroad?
Well, I think here, when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, it is not only the Tibetans who are practicing and following this particular tradition. It is the whole trans-Himalayan belt that are followers of Buddhism, Tibetan form of Buddhism, Bhutan, Mongolia, the Buddhist republics in Russia. So the question is whether it survives or not. But we also must keep in mind that Mongolia is an independent country. Also, we have to keep in mind that Bhutan, though small, it is an independent country. India, the Trans-Himalayan belt, that's a large population. India also being an independent country, though a minority. In Russia as well, though a minority, but we all have a moral responsibility to continue this unbroken lineage, in Buddhism, and I think in Christianity as well. They have this term that they use, which is a unbroken, unstained, or lineage that has continued from Buddha's time. So, of course, these followers of Tibetan form of Buddhism from Mongolia, Bhutan, Nepal, and the Trans-Himalayan belt, and Russia, we all look towards Tibet as the leading or the leader or as the guru. So therefore, we do hope that Tibet issue is resolved in the nearest future. As of right now, we are very fortunate to have the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with us. But the reality is, there will be a day that he will no longer be with us. And it will be a political game for not only for Tibetans, but for the international community. It is very clear that the Chinese are already in the planning of installing a fake Dalai Lama. And how do we challenge that? The Tibetans alone will not be able to challenge that. That's a fact. And we do need the international community to back us up, back us for justice, for rights, and back us for this unbroken lineage, which is very important in the Buddhist tradition and Buddhist culture. So this is one of the reasons why we are gathered here, is to seek support, not for individuals, but seek support for justice. And the Tibetan issue is the issue of justice and human rights and religious freedom, individual freedom, and belief, and so on. So the question, nobody can really predict the future, right? Of course. But nevertheless, we can more or less predict the future based on the global community's effort and sympathy and the power of many of the nations.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vinch, I have a question. You mentioned, Czechoslovakia, of course, was also ruled by the communists. The religion was under assault here. Do you think, is it possible, but it's nothing compared to what's happening in Tibet right now, what I mentioned at the beginning, this re-education camps or these schools for the children. Is it possible? Do you think, is it possible for a country like China or communist government like communist government in China, is it possible to completely eradicate religion out of a population, such as Tibetan population? Do you think?
I hope not. But let me elaborate on this. I think religion is something very deeply rooted into human nature. So any effort to eradicate it would, in fact, openly or covertly mean to convert it to something else. To an extent, communism as an ideology is a substitute religion. So what they are trying to do is, in fact, to convert people to their own religion, being the communist ideology. And I think the communist ideology is in itself morally wrong. I am very convinced about this, and this is the reason why I don't see in the long term something that is objectively morally wrong as on the winning side. So I'm deeply convinced that the Tibetans, Buddhists, and all other religious communities that are at the moment heavily persecuted by the Chinese communists, I very deeply believe that they shall prevail.
Thank you very much. And last question for Mr. Buchung Tsering. It's kind of a double question. I want to ask you if you think there is more the international community can do for the Tibetan issues, for the Tibetan cause. And are you worried that, this whole security situation in the world, this kind of a horrendous war in Ukraine, which can easily spread to other countries, or that conflict in Middle East, which can also spread, will kind of grasp the attention, and then the Tibetan Tibetan problems, or a Tibetan issue can be somehow put on the back burner or can be forgotten? Are you worried about this?
I think I'll answer both parts of the question through one response, and that is that the international community should realize that helping the Tibetan people is not for the sake of the Tibetan people alone. It's helping the international community itself, and therefore, once the government start realizing it, then they'll not see Tibetans just as victims, but Tibetans also as part of this international community of people. With that being said, if that is the situation, then the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people are trying to resolve the issue, find a solution to the issue of Tibet through non-violence. And if you want non-violence to succeed, and if you don't want violence, as you said just now, whether it's Ukraine or in Gaza or in Israel overall, if you don't want, and if you want peace in the world, then you should support more strongly peaceful struggle like the Tibetan community. Sometimes there is this danger that for people like the Tibetans to feel that governments only respond when there is crisis, not realizing that His Holiness the Dalai Lama's effort has enabled Tibet not to be a crisis point as of now, but as alluded earlier, the future is very difficult to say, and then we shouldn't let this Tibet become a crisis point like other places.
Thank you very much. I will now briefly close this morning session. It's been very inspiring to listen to all of the speakers, And besides of all we know, what's happening in Tibet, this basically a genocide, cultural genocide, this attempt by the Chinese Communist government to erase Tibetan identity, Tibetan religion. As I understand it, for me, it's also a struggle of values which are held by Chinese Communist Party, such as hatred, intolerance, absolute lack of compassion or violence against the values of Tibetan Buddhism, which was mentioned here: peace, compassion, love. I think that the Chinese communists must realize very well that the values of Tibetan Buddhism are to people much more appealing than their toxic ideology of violence. Ms. Ten Tasher asked here, why does China, assumably a strong nation, strong country, has to oppress the religious minorities? I think there are two things to this. One is, of course, the hatred, and I hope second is fear. I think the Chinese government is, one positive things to look at from all of this whole oppression, this whole assault of civil society in entire China, I think is betraying how scared, how nervous the communists if China must be. I think they know that their time is numbered. I've lived in China for 7 years as a journalist, and I do not believe that regime there, the whole thing that are imposing on Tibet, but also on the Han population, Chinese Han population, is unnatural. And I do believe it cannot last forever. What I was very happy to hear this morning, although these are very serious issues we were discussing, I've heard from many speakers one word: hope. I think that hope is something that can help people to survive this, what I believe is temporary, although decades-long oppression of religion and of Tibetan minorities or Tibetan nation in Tibet. I think, and what we can do to strengthen that hope, it was also mentioned here, is to let them know very strongly that you are not alone and you will never be alone, that the community of the civilized world is standing behind you. So I would, on this hope notion, I would end this morning session, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your addresses and for your speeches, and I'm very happy to invite you to a break and to some refreshments downstairs. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.